A dozen years ago or more, in the midst of a wide-ranging conversation with an old friend, which inevitably touched on what I would be speaking about at Easter that year, my friend asked me, "Is there any evidence outside of the New Testament that Jesus even existed?" I probably don't need to tell you that my friend is a cynic. I was about to answer no when I remembered that the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus mentioned Jesus in his Antiquities. Although his account is not without its own difficulties as outside corroboration, since it dates from at least 6 decades after the crucifixion, when the Apostle Paul's letters and the Synoptic Gospels were already in circulation. So even Josephus may have been influenced by the emerging Christian tradition and was not necessarily working with evidence external to Christian sources themselves. His account is further complicated by the fact that textual scholars believe it has been edited by later Christian apologists, who inserted text that's almost certainly not from Josephus, who, as a Jew, would never have written some of the things attributed to him. If we strip away the suspect text, we end up with an account that reads more or less like this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused of men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now, even this account is a little suspicious, but I'm willing to accept it as a confirmation of the likely historicity of the man Jesus. After speaking with my friend, I later remembered that there was a second external account by the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, who sometime in the 2nd decade of the 2nd century, that is, more than 80 years after the crucifixion, alluded to Christ in his account of the burning of Rome by Emperor Nero. Remember him? He's the emperor reported to have fiddled while Rome burned. Tacitus reported that to scotch the rumor he had set fire to the Capitol himself, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. In this case, we don't have a reference to the man Jesus, but rather one to Christ, which was a title ascribed to Jesus and not his surname. He was also, curiously enough, this was the subject of the offense that Paul Trutinger, my beloved professor, gave at the beginning of every one of his New Testament classes, when he would have the students all seated and he would start by saying, without fail, the one thing we can say for certainty about Jesus of Nazareth is that he most certainly was not the expected Christ. At which point you can imagine sensitive-souled theological students just melting in their chairs in the classroom. Well, as a result, this account of Jesus is less reliable than that of Josephus insofar as the person of Jesus is confirmed, although it clearly documents the existence of Christians in first century Rome. I don't think there's ever been a doubt about that. But to put these two accounts into perspective, it would be like our having only two references to the existence of Nikola Tesla, who died in 1943, other than testimonials from boosters writing about him starting in the 1980s and onwards. We would have reason to doubt just how accurate the writers' accounts were and wonder whether they were history or fiction or perhaps something in between. We might well question the author's memories. And yet I'm inclined to hold to the view that Jesus was a historical individual, although I can't be certain whether this is a reasoned judgment on my part or simply wishful thinking. Even those who've devoted their lives to discovering the historical Jesus, from David Strauss to Albert Schweitzer, and from John Dominic Crossan to Robert Price, have revealed that it's hard to separate history from mythology. While acknowledging that the stories of Jesus' birth and death are engraved on our imagination as factual history rather than fictional mythology, Dominic Crossan, who was himself a Catholic theologian, nevertheless repeatedly asked the provocative question, is this fact or fiction, history or mythology? I'm not certain that it matters as much as most people think, but I'm confident that it is virtually impossible to know the historical Jesus. Over time, history seems to inevitably succumb to a mythologizing process, and we need only look at how difficult it is to discern fact from fiction in the history of the last 2 centuries to realize that it's well nigh impossible to do so over the span of 2 millennia. So I believe that the Gospels are primarily mythological rather than historical, which frees them actually from the literalism and historicizing that almost inevitably leads to fundamentalism. The quest to discover the historical Jesus seems rather futile, while reading the gospel as literature allows their stories to live without offending our reason. Did Anne of Green Gables need to be a historical person for us to be engaged by her stories? Think of your favorite novel, how real the characters are in that novel. We speak of Ebenezer Scrooge as if he really existed, perhaps because we know his kind from real life. And we cheer for Bob Cratchit. Characters come alive, even though they're fictional, and fictional stories have something to tell us, not just history. Indeed, there are some truths that can only be told through fiction. So when I suggest that the Gospels are largely fictional, it's not to dismiss them, but rather to liberate them and their power. You can bet that in churches across the land, indeed churches around the world, indeed churches across the street, the focus this morning will be on the death and resurrection of Jesus. The story will be told as one that is essential to the salvation of each and every person in each and every congregation, even though most will have only a vague notion of what that even means. And come Monday morning, they will show little evidence that it makes any real difference in their daily lives. And it will never occur to most that they're listening to a folkloric formula or a cycle that is not even exclusive to Christianity. In fairness, Unitarian Universalists who substitute a recurring celebration of the coming of spring as a counterpoint to their neighbors' Easter narratives will be equally unaware of the ways in which they are also engaged in common folkloric motifs and cycles. It's inescapable, and it's powerful. What happened on Easter Sunday, asks Dominic Crossan. Is that the story of one day or of several years? He argues that the Easter story we know today, or think we know, didn't come as an obvious revelation at an open tomb, a sudden flash of insight, but rather evolved over days, months, years, even decades. And we continue to modify the story. In my mind, this parallels the ways in which we mythologized and reimagined the life and work of countless figures throughout history. One of the great Easter stories that gets lost in the shadows because it's something of an anticlimax after the big event outside the tomb is the story of Jesus' encounter with some of his followers on the Emmaus road. Now, you've all had a road to Damascus experience at some point in your life, but few of us talk about our Emmaus road experience. As recounted in the Gospel of Luke, it's the story of two pilgrims walking home to the village of Emmaus from Jerusalem. They are talking with one another about all that had happened in recent days when a stranger joins them. A stranger, we are told, is Jesus, but who they do not recognize. The first sign that we're dealing with literary motifs. The stranger asks them what they're discussing. One of the two, Cleopas, answers asking, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He was incredulous. When the stranger replies, "What things?" he was even more incredulous. But the two pilgrims proceed to tell him about Jesus of Nazareth and his words and deeds, describing how he was betrayed, condemned, and crucified. But we had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel, they lament. They go on to describe how some women of our group had found his tomb empty, but saw a vision of angels. But when others went there, they found only an empty tomb. The stranger then proceeds to scold them for being slow of heart, while reputedly interpreting events to them, beginning with Moses. When they reach Emmaus, the two pilgrims invite the stranger to remain with them, and it's only when they break bread together that their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And then he vanished from sight. The two men returned to Jerusalem, where they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They shared their stories. Now, I never paid much attention, if any, to this part of the Easter story until it was introduced to me by Paul Trudinger. Because, well, it just never came up. We always stop the story at the tomb. Paul argued that this story contains elements which make it seem highly improbable that these events actually occurred on this day, in this short space of time. Hint after hint is given to suggest that the story is a rich cameo portraying the pilgrimage of the early community of believers in Jesus in the days which followed his death and crucifixion. It is a microcosm of a faith journey. The hero's journey, if you prefer Joseph Campbell to other theologians. A faith journey which Paul, perhaps I should call him Dr. Trudinger so you won't confuse him with the apostle of the same name, describes as the risky yet exciting experience of journeying into the unknown. Nearly 2 centuries ago, Emerson lamented that our age is retrospective. But what else could it be? Every era is retrospective, just as our lives are retrospective. I don't know about any of you, but I've never been blessed with precognition. Each new experience in life leads me to adjust my understanding ever so slightly about all that has come before. One can spend their whole life looking ahead for some illuminating insight or wisdom, but in my experience, it's only when we're looking back that we discern intimations of our life's meaning. What appears to be a sudden flash of insight is generally the recognition of a new way to understand the events and experience that have been percolating within us. We may seek for the light at the end of the tunnel, but mostly we are backlit creatures. He came incognito, a stranger, Trudinger notes. He was content to stay that way as he walked with them. He did not press his identity upon them. The significance of our living is present in our living, he continues. It is with us, in us, within our grasp, yet so often recognized incognito. That's the literary point of the story. A point we will miss if we are fixated on treating it as history, something that happened in a particular place, at a particular time, with a particular meaning. And that's what I understand my beloved professor and friend Paul Trudinger to be getting at in this morning's reading. When he says we may experience the mysterious presence of eternity in our lives, giving our traditions, our stories, national, family, and personal stories new meaning, new vitality, new illumination. And this happens often in ways we are not expecting, in contexts where we are apt hardly to recognize what is happening, and thus we may easily miss harvesting the kernel of the experience. The stranger meets with us, often incognito, as the presence of love, of awe, of mystery, in the midst of ordinary living. And this is where I'm going to digress briefly, because I couldn't have expected what would happen this morning. While sitting in the chair over there, I looked out at a delightful little boy who waved to me. And I waved back. And when the choir sang, he danced seated in his chair to the music. And he was animated and joined us for the story. And it was magical for me, and I think exactly what Paul Trudinger meant by the stranger who arrives incognito. Because I have to tell you that when I looked out this morning and I saw his face, I was staring straight into the face of my oldest brother, who has been gone from the earth now nearly 25 years, away from my life. But when I looked at that little boy, he looked so remarkably like my brother at the same age. And his mannerisms and movements were so much like my brother, who was 12 years my senior. And so this morning, for the first time in my life, I got to see my big brother as a little boy. That was the experience on the Emmaus Road, of seeing the familiar and not recognizing it, but also of seeing the unfamiliar and recognizing it. This is why the Christian scriptures and the Hebrew Bible continue to be valuable to us, even if we don't believe the historicity of the books, even if we know better than to read them literally. They still convey powerful stories. And as religious liberals, we are liberated to enjoy them as literary masterpieces rather than as religious instruction manuals or tomes of impossible history. Like Paul Trudinger, I often have occasion to reflect on memories of conversations with those who have made deep impressions upon my life, people who are no longer alive themselves, but who still seem close to me when I close my eyes and listen for their voices in the dim recesses of memory. My father and mother, my grandfather and beloved uncles and aunts, my late brother, and a few of the former ministers of this church, not to mention an awful lot of the lay people who've gone before. Sometimes these memories themselves come to me incognito, and I struggle to recall who said what and what precisely it was that they said. Many times, I will think of something said or something done and come to interpret it in a new way, at times strikingly different from how I once understood it. Other times, a stranger in a public place will make a gesture or a statement that echoes those of people I have known and loved. Like Paul, snippets of poetry, lyrics of song, and passages from books began to take on new meaning, to come alive in my present situation and give light, warmth, and a new liveliness to my living. Through it all, I marvel at the mystery of the world in which we find ourselves. I'm comforted by the love and grace I have known, and I understand the story of the pilgrims on the Emmaus Road is less about Jesus than it was about them and their experiences. In their story, the stranger once revealed simply disappears, reminding us that what we have valued most, love, hope, grace, cannot be clung to as a permanent possession because we are on a pilgrimage. But as Paul Trudinger observes, they will come again and again to us in unexpected places, in surprising ways, often incognito at first, but burning within as a deep inward reality in one climactic revealing after another. Please join in the next hymn, number 1057 in the Teal hymnal, Go Lift It Up.